So if you do not wish to be seen on the recording, then please do feel free to turn off your video. Right, so as I said, we're hosting this. This is being hosted by the Sir Martin Gilbert Learning Centre, which was created in memory of Sir Martin, who, in addition to being the official biographer of Sir Winston Churchill, published 88 books on a wide range of topics, including influential and widely read accounts of the 20th century, the First and Second World Wars, the Holocaust, the history of Israel, and the history of the modern Jewish experience. And he also published a series of pioneering historical atlases. Doubtless some of his works are familiar to some of you. Sir Martin was not only a master chronicler of the modern world, but also had a remarkable ability to bring history alive to his audiences. So fittingly, our aim at the Centre is to bring the finest historical research to a broad, non-academic public and to make history accessible and exciting. We offer a wide range of programs of events and programs across the year on the subjects that Sir Martin spent his life exploring. So please do join our mailing list. I will put a link in the chat when I'm finished with my introduction so that we can let you know about our forthcoming events. Our speaker tonight, of course, is Adam Sutcliffe. He is Professor of European History and co-director of the Centre for Enlightenment Studies at King's College, London. And we're very grateful to you, Adam, for giving of your time to come and speak with us. Adam is a wide-ranging historian whose research has focused on the intellectual history of Western Europe between approximately 1650 and 1850, and on the history of Jews and Jewish and non-Jewish relations in Europe from 1600 to the present. And he is currently working on a book about history and empathy. His previous books include Judaism and Enlightenment, Philo-Semitism in History, which he co-edited, the Cambridge History of Judaism, the Early Modern World, which he also co-edited, and most recently, the book about which he will be talking tonight and which is beautifully displayed on the mantelpiece behind him, What Are Jews For? History, Peoplehood and Purpose, which was published by Princeton University Press. And I will also put details into the chat of how you can get hold of the book should you be interested in doing so. Adam will speak for about 45 minutes, after which I'll open up the floor for your questions and comments. If you like, you're welcome to post your questions in the chat, or you will be able to ask them in person afterwards. So without any further ado, I will hand over to Adam for his talk titled, What Are Jews For? The Idea of Jewish Purpose from the Bible to the Present.
Thank you very much, Shirley, for that very warm and generous introduction. I'm very excited to be talking to you about the core ideas in my book, hopefully whetting your appetite, some of you, to read the book further. I have a PowerPoint. It's not a terribly exciting one. It mostly features 19th century Jewish men with exaggerated beards. So it's good if you like facial hair. You might want, it won't be there permanently. Actually, Shirley, were you going to say briefly how it can be resized? We could start the talk with the first slide now, and if you want to say anything, Shirley, about independent control of the PowerPoint.
Sure. So Adam's concern was just that his picture would remain very small, and sometimes it's kind of boring to just stare at a PowerPoint slide. It is possible, sorry, I'm just letting some more people in. It is possible to adjust your screen such that you can control yourself how large the PowerPoint slide is and how large the face of the speaker is. There should be a line in between on your screen, in between the picture of the speaker and the PowerPoint slide, and you can adjust the size of either of them if you find that you would like to increase the size of the speaker's face.
Or decrease it, of course.
Or decrease it, yes, indeed.
So tiny, you don't have to look at me at all. So I will begin then, and I will begin simply by reading with you this opening quotation for us to consider together. So you can read with me following the slide. We are not obliged to justify our existence by working for the world. Nobody, no other nation, has ever been put under such an obligation. And some of us see it as scandalous that unlike anyone else, unlike everyone else, we have to justify being Jews by serving some further purpose. No one asks a Frenchman why he is there. Everyone asks a Jew why he is there. No one would be content with the statement, I'm just a Jew. Yet, the Jew has every right to be just a Jew and to contribute to what he is by being just what he is. We are always asked to be something exceptional, something supreme, something ultimate. Maybe that very expectation will come to fruition one day, and perhaps then even the enigma of being the chosen people, which is not so easily discarded, will be resolved. So you might want to contemplate for a moment whether you agree with that statement. Perhaps you agree with some parts of it and not other parts of it.
He is studying at the University of Wolverhampton and is looking.
Adam, sorry, I have muted everyone just to keep stray noises out, but you'll need to unmute yourself again, please, Adam.
Yes, I'm back. Also, you might want to enter. I can't see the chat now, Shirley. Is it possible to still see the chat? Oh, yes, I can. Yes. Maybe enter into the chat who you think said this. Any guesses? You can confer with whoever is sitting next to you if you're not watching this alone. Rack your brains and throw out a guess. Take the plunge. Martin Gilbert is wrong. Okay. Theodor Herzl is wrong. Let's wait for 10 or 15 seconds for you all to scratch your heads and muse and see what suggestions pour in, and then I'll tell you.
Mark Twain.
Not Mark Twain. Not Disraeli. Everyone's assuming it's a man, I guess, because of the sexist language. A Frenchman, why he is there. Winston Churchill? No. Stefan Zweig? No. 5 seconds for any final round of applause if anybody gets it right. James Parks, Lord Sachs? No, no, no. No one gets the round of applause unless it comes right now. Dreyfus? No. Okay, could we have the next slide, please, Shirley? Which will reveal the answer. This was said by Gershom Scholem, eminent historian, founder of scholarship on the Kabbalah at the Hebrew University, to whom we will return later in the talk. Great. So, and his talk, I think that quotation opens up some of the puzzles at the core of the idea of Jews having a purpose. In a nutshell, it's an uncomfortable idea for Jews. It's an uncomfortable idea that marks Jews apart from others, but it's also, in another sense, foundational to the idea of the Jews as a chosen people, which, as he says rightly, is not so easy to discard, even if we don't quite understand what it means. So if we could suspend the PowerPoint for the next little while, and I'll try to unpack on some of those ideas. So what are Jews for? The question is at first sight absurd and impertinent, if not worse. Jews, like everybody else, live for the most part muddled and meandering lives without any notably clear sense of purpose, either as individuals or as a collective. To single out any group of people as bearers of a designated role or responsibility in the world seems invidious. Why them? And to single out Jews feels particularly awkward. The perception of Jews as somehow irreducibly different from others, and their portrayal as semi-clandestine conspirators machinating to advance particular goals, are long-standing and familiar tropes of anti-Semitism. Is it not high time, then, for this question to be unambiguously laid to rest? Should we not today clearly insist that Jews of all people have no need to justify their existence, and should not in any sense be understood as performing some historical function for the rest of humanity? And yet, the question, as Scholem said, cannot be easily evaded. The idea that Jews are bestowed with a particular historical purpose occupies a central position both in the Jewish tradition itself and in the Christian and post-Christian frameworks that have structured Western thinking about the place of the Jews as a unique minority in the wider world. The question of Jewish purpose follows inescapably, I would say, from Jewish chosenness, which lies at the heart of Judaism. God chose the Jews, but why? On what terms and to what end? The biblical election of Israel, the setting apart of the Jews by God as recipients of divine protection and bearers of special holiness, ineluctably gives rise to a whole set of further questions. What does it mean for a universal God to single out a particular people? Where does this leave other peoples in the eyes of God and in their relationship to Jews? Can the election of Israel be rescinded, either for all Jews or for individuals among them? And what happens if individual Jews do reject their covenant with God, whatever precisely that means? And I think this is the biggest question, for what precise role in the world and in the messianic denouement of human history did God select the Jews? And why, of all people, them? Or, if we're Jews, us? Cogitating on these questions, the early sages and rabbis developed various theological avenues of response, elaborating on the Jews' unique intimacy with God and their special place in the divine plan for the world. The Church Fathers, founding theologians of Christianity, starting from the same biblical texts, particularly the books of Exodus and Isaiah, originated the tradition of Christian theological thinking on the election and historical purpose of the Jews, which both overlaps with Jewish perspectives and has been enduringly central to the tension between the two religions. So if we go back to the ancient Near East, it was, it seems, unexceptional to believe that one's own God was in some sense the only true God, and was certainly superior to the gods of other tribes and polities. And in this respect, the perspective of the Jewish Bible, I think we can take to be broadly representative, broadly typical almost, of the prevailing religious norms of the region around, let's say, the 8th century BCE. The limited historical evidence available, and of course it's much argued over and unclear, but it suggests that peoples living around the ancient Hebrews, such as the Moabites and the Ammonites, understood their intimate relationships with their own deities in broadly similar terms to those put forward in the prophetic books of the Bible. In the Hellenistic and Roman periods, moving forward in time, the monotheistic focus of the Jews marked them more clearly apart from the syncretic paganism of the dominant culture. It was only with the emergence of Christianity, though, that Jewish religious and ethnic separateness became firmly welded together and conceived as the defining hallmark distinguishing Judaism in its separateness from the universalist message and mission of the self-defined Catholic, meaning all-embracing, church. The significance of the Jews' separateness and of their special relationship with God was a matter of serious reflection among the early and medieval rabbis. However, for as long as Jews lived in a clearly subordinate position within Christian states and also Muslim states, and those were states which not only accepted but enforced the segregation of Jews to a considerable extent, these questions had no direct practical significance and were not a focus of contention between the three faiths. Medieval Islam exhibited no particular concern with questions of Jewish purpose, and in any case was much more polemically engaged with arguing with Christians and Christianity than with or about Judaism. From a medieval Christian perspective, the dispersal and suffering of Jews reflected their rejection by God for having failed to accept his son as the Messiah, and any political implications of their status as nonetheless in some sense still God's chosen people, which was what Christians believed and in broad brush terms still do believe, whatever that meant that the Jews were still God's chosen people, was a question for the future, and probably the distant future, not for now. It was only when that changed, though, and some Christians began to believe that a transformed future, the Messianic age, was not distant, but possibly imminent, that this question became more important. And that change, thinking about the Messianic age as being possibly close and the transformation of the world as being close, happened at the same time and was connected to a change of attitudes towards Jews in practical terms. The idea among Christians that Jews should not be held apart as separate, but in some way integrated into the political mainstream and treated with tolerance, another complicated idea. So it's really from the 17th century, the 1600s, that European Jews and Christians developed a new shared language of talking about politics, and at the same time, and as part of that debate, a shared conversation about the proper place of Jews in the present and also the future. So that's really where my story begins. I'm interested in the story of thinking about Jewish purpose as a shared conversation between Jews and Christians, beginning really from the 17th century, and I try to track it forward all the way through to the present. So if we could return to the third slide now on the PowerPoint, one important figure in the opening phase of this story is Baruch Spinoza, who was the first Jew emphatically to reject the doctrine of the election of Israel. And Baruch Spinoza was writing in the mid-17th century, causing great excitement among non-Jews by his writings, and writing at the same time, more or less, when another Jew, Shabbatai Tzvi, created great excitement when he, Shabbatai Tzvi, declared himself as the Jewish Messiah. So these questions of messianism and transformation were in the air as Jews and Christians began to rethink what Jewish chosenness meant. When we move into the 19th century, the Enlightenment tries to cogitate over these questions. And then we reach a point around the end of the 18th century with Jewish emancipation moves to really draw the Jews into the mainstream of European political life, a move that's very gradual and tortuous and contested, but it happens and it's very, very important. In that period, the era of Jewish emancipation around the late 18th, early 19th centuries, many European intellectuals, both Jewish and Christian, believed that the ancient religion of Judaism didn't really serve any further purpose because we were moving into a new era of transformed reason where these differences between peoples would melt away. And this was summarized very pithily and also quite controversially, and in the light of later history, in terms of his choice of words, rather disturbingly, by Immanuel Kant, who talked about the euthanasia of Judaism, the voluntary suicide of Judaism as being the imminent step in the history of Judaism. As we move into the 19th century, Jews who rejected the idea of a move from Judaism to secularism, essentially, which is what Kant really, or to reason, which is what Kant really meant by the euthanasia of Judaism. Jews who rejected that idea needed to find new arguments for the value of perpetuating Jewish difference and Jewish religion in the modern world. So it was really reform rabbis, the new movement emerging in the early 19th century in response to these new modern conditions of living, who put forward more vigorously than ever before the idea that the Jews had a mission to the world, to the modern world, as teachers of ethics and spirituality for all. And that idea of a Jewish mission for the world around spirituality, monotheism, and philosophy, we see very, very central in the writings of reform rabbis such as Abraham Geiger, most of the leading reform rabbis from Germany who then found Reform Judaism in the United States later in the 19th century, and indeed a number of Orthodox rabbis as well. They were putting forward these arguments in contest against many other quite different notions of Jewish distinctiveness that were circulating in the 19th century, linking Jews to having a special role in capitalism and also in anti-capitalism, on the right, if you will, or in economic life, and also on the left, And this could be seen in positive terms, but it was also seen by a number of people in negative terms. And I would argue that either way, it's limiting just to think about those debates about Jews and capitalism and communism simply in terms of anti-Semitism or philo-Semitism. We also need to understand those debates as a grappling over the question of in what way Jews are special and have a role and a mission in the transformation of the world in the modern era. The Zionist movement is very interesting in those terms because one aspect of the Zionist movement was a rejection of all of these notions of Jewish exceptionalism and a push towards Jewish normalization. If we move to the next slide, one leading early Zionist, the founding thinker of cultural Zionism, was Ahad Ha'am. Here we move to the promised impressive range of facial hair on my slides. Ahad Ha'am, intellectual of cultural Zionism in Odessa in the early 19th century, and then moving to the Yishuv. He felt that it was desperately craven of Jews to try to justify their role in the world as a contribution to Western society. He felt the rabbinical leadership, particularly the reform and progressive rabbinical leadership in Western Europe, was desperately, cravenly trying to win the approval of the Goyim by talking about Jewish mission. And Zionism was to be the corrective of that, where Jews could simply just be themselves for themselves in their own terms, not as a contribution to others. And yet, the history of Zionism has also featured very prominently the citation of the famous verse from Isaiah that the Jews and a Jewish state should be a light unto the nations. David Ben-Gurion, first Prime Minister of Israel, used that phrase a great deal in his speeches. So Zionism itself has a complex relationship to Jewish exceptionalism and purpose, both trying to flee from it and actually shifting it into a different, in a sense, a higher gear in relation to the Jewish state. Thinking more generally about Jewish purpose in the 20th century, in many ways, over the last 100 years, the question of Jewish historical purpose has become an increasingly awkward and often even an embarrassing topic in public debate. In the early 20th century, many Jewish leaders and intellectuals thought that because of Jewish election and special purpose, resentment of that special purpose was inevitable, and therefore anti-Semitism was also inevitable, and indeed possibly understandable that others would resent Jews being special and being chosen by God. Hermann Cohen, who was the leading Jewish interpreter of Immanuel Kant and one of the most important German Jewish philosophers of the first couple of decades of the 20th century, he, alongside many others, in fact, used the word Leidensvolk to describe the Jews, a suffering people. The Jews are a suffering people. Suffering is part of their historical burden, and it is something that is inexplicably associated and a consequence of their chosenness and their specialness. It is a burden that Jews cannot escape from. That is not a word that is in circulation anymore in association with Jews, and the reason is obvious. It's because of the Holocaust. Since the Shoah, the argument that Jewish suffering must be accepted as the negative, dark side of Jewish exceptionality and chosenness has become impossible to entertain once Jewish suffering was seen and witnessed on such a scale. People have also moved away from Jewish chosenness for other reasons. If we think about Western communities, particularly in the United States, but also in Britain, Jewish chosenness in the post-Holocaust period has felt to highlight difference and specialness in a way that goes against the grain of attempts by 20th century Jews to fit in to the societies in which they live. Mordecai Kaplan, the founding intellectual of Reconstructionism, the most American form of Judaism in the interwar period, rejected the concept of mission and chosenness as part of his wider attempt to purge Judaism of what he regarded as its unwarranted and outdated claims of exclusivity and superiority. But nonetheless, despite many attempts to turn down the volume of Jewish chosenness, it persists in Jewish thought, as we've already seen in that quote from Gershom Scholem. So if we can move to the next slide now, who's a figure who might be familiar to some of you, Louis Jacobs, towering intellectual of British Judaism in the late 20th century. His thoughts on this subject are very interesting. Louis Jacobs argued when he wrote on the topic in 1973 that medieval Jewish rabbis already found the doctrine of chosenness, quote, something of an embarrassment. And Jacobs himself rejected arguments for the qualitative difference of Jews over others, and was at pains to distance that idea from Nazi notions of racial superiority, which was an anxiety that Kaplan also raised in the Nazi period itself in the 1930s. While acknowledging its dangers, though, Louis Jacobs nonetheless argued that Jewish collective self-understanding as a chosen people was of value in affirming commitment to the covenant and what he described as a sense of identity. And this, I would say, has remained broadly the consensus view in certainly diaspora Judaism. While the topic is relatively little addressed directly, serious attempts have been made to defend and develop the theology of the election of Israel, paying careful attention to its implications for the relationship between Jews and non-Jews. But the question of Jewish purpose is not simply a theological matter. The insistence within the Jewish tradition on the this-worldly dimension of the final redemption to which the Jewish election in some way points, that this messianic moment when the Jewish mission will be fulfilled will transform our world for the better. That idea blurs the boundary between the religious and the secular, or one might say, if one thinks of true transformation as inherently political, it blurs the boundary between the religious and the political. Jewish distinctiveness has also been historically associated with a wide range of non-religious qualities and values: rationalism, textuality, intellectuality, idealism, ethical rigor, cultural vitality, and collective cohesion. Jews today, if they choose to identify positively with Jewishness, may be asserting a connection to any of those traditions I've just listed, which they may link to their sense of personal purpose in entirely secular terms. So the purpose of Judaism today is not necessarily the same question as the purpose of Jews as individuals or as affinity groups within the world. So if we could maybe switch off the PowerPoint for a bit, and I'd like to share with you some of my core methodological principles, if that's not too pompous a phrase, through which I try to explore the question of Jewish purpose in my book. And there are three of them, three kind of guiding lights that I set out in my introduction. And the first is that we must see this question historically. The idea of Jewish purpose, although it is rooted in the Bible and cogitated on by rabbis, it has changed. It has evolved in dialogue between Jews and Christians in a world that is continuously changing. The difference between the period before Jewish emancipation, when transformation was seen as something that would happen in the future, is profoundly different, for example, than the world we've lived in since the French Revolution, I would say, in broad brush terms, in which dramatic transformation is happening around us now. And I would say from the early 19th century Jewish purpose has been centrally connected to the transformations that are most important in the unfolding present of politics, left and right-wing politics, of nationalism, of economics, of culture. So we can't think about what Jews are for in the world without paying attention to that historical baggage and its complexity. Secondly, and this is something that flows from thinking of Jewish purpose in terms of historicity, we need to recognize that the question of Jewish purpose involves both Jews and non-Jews in a shared dialogue. It's been a common debate. In theological terms, Jews are important for Christians in the heralding of the Messianic age, in the final transformation of the world, and they're very important for many Christians' interest in the state of Israel in the present. So this is a very hot political issue in the theological politics of now, especially in the United States, where those views are very influential. But more broadly in cultural terms, Jews have meaning that punches well above their or our weight in relation to thinking about the future of philosophy, politics, economics, and sociology, and how any group can contribute in a special way to bringing about change in those various domains. So it's a shared conversation in historical terms, it's a dialogue, and also, and this is my third guiding principle, it matters not just historically, but also philosophically, and I'm tempted even to say existentially, for all of us. How to live purposefully or purposively as a Jew obviously has a special lived experience for those of us who are Jewish. However, we cannot consider this topic as something that somehow Jews have cultural ownership of, because it's about us. Because precisely historically, it's been part of a dialogue with non-Jews. It's eminently understandable that any group might wish to define in its own terms their collective purpose without intervention from others. But in the Jewish case, the weight of history, including above all the role of exceptionalist conceptions of Jews in marking the path to their genocide, has intensified that desire, the desire among Jews to say, maybe let's not talk about Jewish purpose at all, but if anyone's going to talk about it, leave it to us, please. However, far from leading to a normalization of the place of the Jews in the world, the Holocaust, I argue in my book, has deepened the burden of meaning on Jewish history in wider thinking on the interpretation of the past. And the establishment of the State of Israel, contrary to the hopes and expectations of some, has also not reduced but heightened the sense of uniqueness, high stakes, controversy, and confusion surrounding the place of Jews in the world. In academic circles, since the 1990s, there has been intense debate about what has been called the figural Jew, the abstract Jew, as separate from embodied, living, breathing Jews. And that controversy has centered on when, how, and by whom this abstraction is acceptable, particularly when meanings are ascribed to the figure of the Jew that are sharply distinct from, or even in opposition to, the self-understandings of many, or possibly even most, Jews. And that debate sometimes intersects with heated political controversies over anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, the Israel-Palestine conflict, and the place of utopian radicalism in the world today. However much we might wish it to be otherwise, the meanings of Jewishness, and particularly of Jewish historical purpose, are profoundly intertwined with these central issues of global debate. So it's quite clear, I think, why we might want to say in the face of this, enough already, it's all too much. Can't we simplify and diffuse all this intensity around the meaning of Jewishness in the world. But I'd like to suggest there are some good reasons why we might not wish to take flight from this question. The meanings of minority status, of being different as a group, have in the Western tradition been most extensively explored, I would say by far most extensively explored, by and in relation to Jews. These reflections provide a very rich starting point for thinking about the significance of any collective social identity as part of a wider human whole. Zionism was a belated nationalist movement. Most other nationalisms had got going well before the late 19th century, when Zionism as a political movement begins. But the early modern formation of national identities in the Bible-saturated Protestant world in particular, in England, as a case in point, took place in conscious emulation of the Hebraic example. The actual and potential resonances of the case of Jewish purpose extends far beyond the realm of historical nationalism. Many different forms of identity are today jostling for status, meaning, and value. What is the worth, we might ask, in asserting a regional, supranational, ethnic, religious, or sexual identity as, let us say, Scottish, or European, or Black, or Buddhist, or bisexual, or any of those at once, and potentially indeed all of them at once? What is the meaning of claiming those identities in today's mobile and multicultural world, in which our collective affiliations are more fluid and complicated than ever? How are those identities defined? And in what way should they claim respect, not simply as inescapable givens, I'm Scottish just because I am, or as self-interested and competing interest groups, but for whatever distinctive element they contribute to our shared planetary existence, the contribution to the world of being European or Buddhist or Black or Scottish. These are difficult questions that concern us all, and we all wear multiple hats. And a promising way, perhaps the most promising place to begin in thinking about the meta questions behind those issues, is with the modern history of attempts to answer and explore those questions with respect to Jews. If the Jewish case indeed proves to be a stimulating and illuminating guide to clarifying our thinking on collective purpose in general, then that itself provides a first answer to the question of what Jews are for in the world. What are Jews for? To help us think about what we are for, whatever our identity might be. So, heading towards the close, if we could return to the PowerPoint now, skipping one slide onto slide 8, please, Shirley. Thank you very much. Returning to the history, oh, sorry, not slide 8, slide 7, sorry, thank you. Returning to the history of how to tell the story of this question, the essential starting point is the Bible. So there are various important proof texts to turn to. Perhaps the most obvious one is Exodus 19, verses 5 to 6, which you should see on your screen. Now then, if you will obey, this is God, obviously, the voice of God. Now then, if you will obey me faithfully and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession among all the peoples. Indeed, all the earth is mine, but you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. So one could discuss the exegesis of that for a very, very long time, and a lot of my book is devoted to that. One very important phrase is a kingdom of priests. What does it mean to conceive of the relationship of Jews to non-Jews as priests to their flock? In some ways, Jews are ministering to others as priests. And that is one foundational theme in thinking about Jewish purpose. This Exodus verse and various others from Isaiah and others have been cogitated on by the medieval rabbis in various complicated ways. If we look at those medieval rabbis briefly, Judah Halevi took the view that Jews were inherently superior to non-Jews. In fact, Louis Jacobs, I would say, is absolutely wrong in saying that the medieval rabbis, as a rule, thought that the idea of Jewish chosenness and specialness was embarrassing and clearly unlike any sort of notion of superiority. Judah Halevi very clearly sees Jews as inherently, quasi-biologically, indeed, superior to others. Whereas Maimonides looks at things rather a bit differently and thought that the special feature of the Jews was their philosophical inclination, and that their election was conditional on the perpetuation of their special role as thinkers, and therefore perhaps implicitly a designation that the Jews would lose if they ceased to be a philosophical people. For medieval Christians, meanwhile, building on the witness people theology of Augustine, the purpose of Jews was to provide evidence through their dispersal and suffering and their dogged preservation of the scriptural texts that they nonetheless so woefully misinterpreted of the truth of Christianity. So all three of those approaches, from Halevi, Maimonides, and Augustine, have remained important through to the present. And a lot of my book tries to trace the resonance of those currents of thought about Jewish specialness through to the present. I'm going to jump a little bit, if we could. There isn't another slide. Yeah, so we could switch the PowerPoint off now, perhaps, at this point. If we go back to where we started now, really, and think about Zionism, Sholem and Ahadam and others. Zionism is fascinatingly ambivalent about Jewish exemplarity and special historical purpose. So we have, on the one hand, a cultural Zionist attempt to some degree to normalize Judaism. We have David Ben-Gurion citing the Light unto the Nations rhetoric of Isaiah, and also trying to rehabilitate Spinoza as a figure of secular Jewish exceptionalism that he wanted to attach to Jewish identity and Jewish purpose in the world. And then we have very, very complicated hopes in relation to Israel as, in some ways, a normalization of the Jews' place in the world, and in other ways, a focus of thinking about Jewish specialness. And that, all that ambivalence, I think, is crisply pulled together in the quote from Sholem with which we began. So where are we now with all of this? And that's where I'm going to end. And then I'm very interested to hear your questions. In contemporary debates, we hear frequent calls for Jews, and particularly Israel, to be regarded and judged on the same basis as all others, with any deviation from normal treatment often condemned as anti-Semitic. I don't want to open up a huge discussion about the Labour Party and the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, but in fact, one of the central ideas in that definition is that not to think of Israel, or indeed of Jews, in the same way as one thinks of anybody else, is anti-Semitic. However, that idea sits somewhat awkwardly, to say the very least, alongside the ubiquity in history and in the present of the theme of Jewish exceptionality and special purpose. As the originary minority in Western societies, Jews have historically been destabilizers of the very idea of the normal. Indeed, some have seen, and would still see today, Jewish purpose as being precisely in highlighting the importance of difference and of repudiating the very idea of there being such a thing as normality, certainly as a desire, as something desirable. Jews have had great difficulty wrestling with this tension over the course of the past century, particularly in America, where the urge to fit in has been most seductive and also felt to be most possible. The idea of chosenness and the notion of collective purpose that accompanies it has, though, been almost indispensable in Jewish religious life. Normality is perhaps now a more widely accepted aspiration than ever before. Jews, for as long as they are not eviscerated of any sense of collective purpose, will, despite the unease of many with this role, continue to represent, I think, a nub of resistance to this acceptance of the desirability of being normal. So, final paragraph. What then are Jews for, above all? I've already thrown out various possibilities, but if I had to give my own very distilled answer, I can get it down, I think, to one word, and that word is hope. A still awaited messianism is fundamental to the Jewish conception of time. In Christianity, although the Messiah is understood to have arrived, messianic return remains linked in vastly different ways for different Christian denominations to the Jewish future. The Messianic age will be when the Jewish Messiah arrives. And in secular thought, or semi-secular thought, if we think of a sort of grey zone between religion and secularism, in that domain, many critics have seen a modulation of Jewish prophetic currents of this worldly messianic expectancy in Marxist or other radical demands for justice in our world. All these various versions of the idea of Jewish purpose over the past 4 centuries can be related in some way to this messianic orientation. Indeed, the very idea of having purpose in the world carries with it an implicitly messianic faith in the future, without which there would be no point in the fulfillment of that purpose. Hope, then, I think, is the overarching and indispensable framework, historically and still in the present, for thinking about the awkward and inescapable idea of Jewish purpose in our world. And there I am.
Thank you so much, Adam, for a very thought-provoking talk that ranged over quite a lot of terrain and introduced lots of interesting ideas, lots of food for thought. I wonder if I can start off the questions, kick off the questions. And if you would like to ask questions, I already see a couple of people have their hands up and one in the chat. Please feel free to make yourself known. My question, Adam, is really an overarching question, which is really also geared towards thinking about what people can expect from the book itself. Yours is obviously an intellectual history. You know, you introduced to us a long list of all men. That's for a separate conversation. You know, of men who are leaders, who are philosophers, Zionist leaders, religious leaders, and so on. And then I was also struck by the one of your guiding principles, which was the idea that this matters for all of us. These are not just philosophical or intellectual conversations. These are issues that have and can and should concern all of us. So I wondered if you could just say a little bit about the interface in your work, in the book, and how you're thinking between, you know, what these men are thinking and actually the lived experience of Jews.
Well, if I could start with the sub-question of women, and I apologize for not having incorporated women into the names I picked out in this talk.
Oh, it's not your fault. I didn't mean it. I meant a separate conversation, as in there are reasons for that. Yes.
You're right to, and it leads absolutely into your main question. There are important women discussed in the book, and more as we approach the 20th century, Jewish and non-Jewish. George Eliot, for example, and Daniel Deronda is a central text to think about Jewish purpose. She was a great believer in Jewish peoplehood as a beacon for demonstrating the meaning and the potential of peoplehood and national pride and national distinctiveness for all of us. And, you know, Daniel Deronda is the text, I think, that pulls that together better than any. Among Jews, Hannah Arendt, for example, is a fascinatingly important thinker on Jewish purpose, and she's committed to, in a nutshell, a universalistic vision of of the ethical tradition in Judaism, and rejects in her famous correspondence with Gershom Scholem the idea that Jews should have a special love for other Jews. Scholem accuses Hannah Arendt of not having enough love of other Jews, and she says, well, I reject that entire term. I love all humanity. But she says, when wrong is done by my own people and in the name of my own tradition, that pains me more than wrong that is done by others. And I see Arendt as a very important articulator of a tradition of self-critique as a form of Jewish purpose, or as an understanding of what Jewish identity and Jewish political responsibility should be in the world. So her argument, and this is really in relation to Israel, which she hoped to be, in some ways, despite her rejection of special love for Jews, she was a Zionist in earlier parts of her career, committed to try to help Jews to get to Palestine, and had hopes for the state of Israel. When it ended up leading to a Palestinian refugee crisis, she felt this is not the Israel that I want, essentially, and it is the responsibility of Jews, because of the pain that wrong done by Jews does for other Jews, to speak out against this. So I think that is a form of, through her work, a tradition of Jewish purpose, if you will, underpinning, I think, quite a lot of Jewish left activism around criticism of Israel in the world today. Another interesting woman to think about, which opens up in particular these questions of experience, is Lily Montagu. Lily Montagu, who, along with Claude Montefiore, founded liberal Judaism in this country at the beginning of the 20th century. Both Claude Montefiore and Lily Montagu were very interested in the idea of Jewish mission and Jewish purpose. Claude Montefiore, in his typical male way, wrote about it endlessly. Lots of theory, lots of theology, lots of pontification and books, all quite interesting, but rather abstract. Lily Montagu did it. What she felt this meant was creating clubs for young Jewish women who perhaps have to work in shops on Shabbos and were unable to get to synagogue, to offer them religious instruction, philosophical instruction, opportunities for sociability, and also practical training. It also meant working with other progressives in East London in particular, where her father was an MP, to build alliances to address poverty across communities, to build alliances with women from other faith traditions and within secular socialism around women's suffrage. So she felt throwing herself into politics, not just for Jews, but for all, and working alongside others, was itself a living, in practical terms, of her understanding of Jewish purpose. And so I think actually women, it's a crude generalization, but were particularly likely to actually think about the practical out of
and she was a member of Parliament, which was very prominent.
Thank you. Please go ahead. Your screen name is Debbie Herman. Yes, please go ahead and ask your question.
Yes, it's Bernard Herman, in fact. Most of your lectures concern Jewish religious traditions that are broadly in the Western traditional thought, Reform, Conservative Judaism, or indeed Zionism. Now, over the last 25 years, there's been a resurgence of Haredi Judaism, which both demographically and ideologically, which has been, in theory, should be in practice, is a complete refutation of both Zionism and of a broad Western intellectual tradition that most of modern Jewish religious movements are drawn upon. Would you care to comment about that, both in terms of the present perspective and how this will interact with the other movements in the future?
Yes, I'll do my best, but as I'm sure you know, that's an extremely complicated topic, because Haredi Judaism is diverse, and there are within Haredi Judaism, but there's quite a bit about it in my book, actually. So for the detail,
read the book.
but
Read
for
the book.
Short answer, Well, I mean, anti-Zionism, of course, is strongest within certain Haredi Jewish circles, and it's related to Haredi traditions of messianism and of Jewish purpose. That Jews will play a transformative role in the Messianic age and in the changes that will impact on the entire world and all peoples when that Messianic moment happens. But God will determine when that will happen and the moment for it. And it is blasphemous for Jews to take this into their own hands, because the ingathering of Jews in Zion is part of that Messianic chain of events that should not be hastened by humans. So in the Satmar tradition, this was the Satmar Haredi tradition, this was, and I think effectively is, Satmar theology. And the Satmar theology of the Holocaust was that it was a sort of divine punishment for Jewish secularism and for Zionism. So there's that view. If you look at the Lubavitch, really, really fascinating and a bit too, I'll do my best to summarize in 1 minute, but it's difficult. But the final Lubavitcher Rebbe was clear, explicit, that non-Jews are here in the world to facilitate Jews observing Judaism. So you couldn't be more sort of Jewish supremacist than that at a certain level. What non-Jews should do is help Jews be Jewish, because it's Jews being Jewish and observing the commandments that will then hasten the Messianic era. But that Messianic era will be transformative for everybody. So in that sense, everyone, Jewish and non-Jewish, in their different ways, are working for a better world, transformed through that Messianic moment, in which Jews are destined and chosen to play a special role. I draw, though, in my book on Elliot Wolfson's very interesting work on the thinking of Rabbi Schneerson, the final Lubavitcher Rebbe, in which he says that there's another strand of Schneerson's thought, which is that in a sense, the Messianic age is already here if we only wake up and smell the coffee, if it, as it were. The Messianism is a state of mind. It's something that we need to embrace around us in the now, and not only think in the future. So that puts further complexity on the theology of Messianism and Jewish, non-Jewish relations. But to be completely honest, I'm not sure if I completely understand what Schneerson is saying there. But it's a very rich and complicated topic. But you're absolutely right. The Haredim are a fascinating strand and an essential one to track through this question.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Adam. So there are quite a number of further questions. We will try our best to get through all of them, but possibly we won't. I'm going to call next on Jonathan Lewis, who put a question in the chat, but I think, Jonathan, you're happy to say it in person. Go ahead.
Yes, thank you. Lord Emanuel Jakobowicz, the former chief rabbi, addressed this issue. As I understand what he said this: every individual is unique. Every individual has a unique purpose and mission in life, which only that person can fulfill. That, he said, is what makes us human beings. Similarly, he said, the same is true of peoples, of nations. Every people and every nation has been chosen for something. Greece, as I recall, he gave as an example, has been chosen for beauty, for aesthetics. Britain has been chosen for the rule of law, and so on. And the Jewish people, he said, has been chosen for holiness. So he took the concept of chosenness, but he viewed it not as a unique concept, but as in itself a universal concept. Do you have a view about that?
Adam, Before you begin, if I may, I'm going to jump in with another question that came in the chat that in a way comes at this from a different angle, and in the interests of getting more voices in. This is from Eugene McConlow, who says, surely the title question of your talk is predicated on the assumption, for me extremely tendentious, that humans have a purpose at all, something that separates humans from other species. Does anyone ask, what are giraffes for in this context? If you're able to convincingly answer what humans are for vis-a-vis giraffes, then we could more logically develop and focus the same question on Jews, Uyghurs, and any other ethnic groups.
That's very interesting. And I didn't think about giraffes and animals, and perhaps I should, but in my defense, there's an awful lot in the book already, and I didn't want to spread myself too thin. But I think you touch in a very kind of sharp and witty way on the question of what it means to be human, and whether what perhaps does separate that from animals, which I think most people most of the time have thought is in some way related to purposiveness, to having a purpose, and that is related to having collectives. You know, we choose to be part of groups so that we can do something in the world to make it better as a collective. And that leads to the other question. Now, giraffes, I don't think giraffes do that. I think giraffes have ways of grouping but that are essentially instinctual and not reflected upon. And that's the question of particular giraffes trying to do something particular for the world as distinct for other giraffes in another group, I think would not apply to giraffes, but does apply to people, and always has, because the division of humanity into groups that both fight against each other, but also make claims for their superiority, their role, their contribution to the world, goes back to really the dawn of human history. And Jacobowicz's formulation, which I wasn't familiar with specifically, so thank you, is a variation on many, many ways of talking about all peoples having a role, the Jews having a role alongside others, but then the Jews' role always being in some way a bit different in category terms from those of others. So I was going, actually, if I hadn't rambled a bit too much at the beginning, I was going to include a short quote in my talk from Moses Hess, who was one of the early thinkers of Zionism in the 1860s. And he puts forward a model very much like Jacobowicz's one, and he wasn't the first himself to do it. And he says that the Germans, he was German, a German Jew, so of course the German Jews are for Germany is for philosophy and for thinking. I think he says Britain, in a rather weird way, is for the digestive system of humanity, the alimentary system, a sort of assimilatory function. France has energy because they have lots of revolutions, so it's about the motion in history. And the Jews, he says, are, quote, the living creative force in universal history. They are the organ of unifying and sanctifying love. So they are the people that connect everything together. And in fact, Hess's formulation is an adaptation, and I think he knew this, of what Judah Halevi himself said in the 12th century. And he also says every person, every people in the world has a role, like an organ of the body, and the Jews are the heart. So they're at the middle, they're the symbolically most important, and they're sort of the pump that keeps the whole going. So the Jews have a role just like everybody, but it's a special one. And I would say that applies to Jacobowicz's formulation as well. If you say Jews are for holiness, that's of a different order than to say Germans are really good at engineering, or Italians are really good at cooking and provide us with great recipes. The status and the meaningfulness of saying what Jews are for, their particular role is holiness, puts them in some ways alongside others, but also above others. And in fact, 19th century rabbinical mission of Israel theology again and again formulates it in those broad terms as well.
Thank you. Next question is from Jay Goodgold. Jay, would you like to ask your question? I'm not sure whether Jay is still there. I sent a message and didn't receive a response. So I think in the meantime, I shall ask a question on behalf of Claire Lafole, who put this into the chat. And she asks, where do Shimon Dubnov's and other Central and Eastern European Jewish thinkers of autonomism, she mentions people like Shidlovsky, Renner, Bauer, fit into this reflection on exceptionalism and purpose? How do you see this secular and non-Zionist idea of Jews as being a spiritual nation that doesn't need a territory, that doesn't emanate from their chosenness, but is the reason for their uniqueness in the past and present?
That's very interesting and also very complicated. And I suppose I could connect this in a sense to Ahad Ha'am, because although Ahad Ha'am was a Zionist, he was in some ways similar to the people you're mentioning, like Dubnov, other Eastern Europeans, who felt that really what was important about Jewishness was that it was spiritual, it was abstract, not so different to Jacobowicz's formulation in some ways, holy. This also is connected to the idea of Jews as the guardians of the purest form of monotheism, precisely because Jewish monotheism is rigorously abstract, whereas, as seen from a Jewish point of view, at least, mostly, in the Trinity and Jesus as the divine and Jesus being human and representable, etc., is a more diluted form of the pure monotheism of Judaism. So that idea of the spiritual and the abstract being what Jews are guardians of, and that being Jewish purpose, is a very important tradition. And absolutely, it has been important. It's parallel within Zionism, but it's also been very important in a number of forms of non-Zionist or anti-Zionist thinking. One thinker in that vein, who I do write about in the book quite a bit, is Franz Rosenzweig, a German Jew, not an Eastern European Jew, so not quite the same tradition as the people you're talking about, but he says that nationhood for most European peoples, say the Germans, is about blood and soil. You can be German by blood, but you're connected to the German soil. Jewishness is all on the blood and not about the soil. So that was an argument against Zionism, but in favor for, in contrast to that, the abstraction, the disconnect, the outsiderness of the nationalisms of Europe that he saw, having fought in World War I, as having disastrous consequences in Europe, that the Jewish mission was really to preserve that non-land-based nationalism, that in doing that disseminated a really important lesson about there being a more lofty way of thinking about who we are than in connecting it to land.
Thank you. Well, I think given the time, I'm going to wrap it up there, and apologies to those of you whose questions we didn't get to. A few of you also sent me questions by a private chat. But I am going to take this opportunity to thank Adam once again very, very much on behalf of the Sir Martin Gilbert Learning Centre for taking the time to come and talk to us, for giving us a lot of food for thought from your fascinating book, which, as you say, ranges even more widely than your talk. And I can highly recommend it. And a reminder that if you'd like to buy the book with a 25% discount, that code is in the chat. So please go ahead and take a look at that. I've also just put into the chat the link that you can click on if you would like to join our mailing list at the Sir Martin Gilbert Learning Centre, and we warmly invite you to do so. I'd also like to briefly remind you of 2 upcoming events that we have. A talk by Eliana Adler in a couple of weeks on titled Survival on the Margins, which will look at the experiences of Polish Jewish refugees who survived World War II in the Soviet Union, which is a remarkable and untold story. That's on the 7th of April at 7 p.m. UK time, also free. And also the 3rd of our Sir Martin Gilbert Churchill conversations, which we're running in partnership with the International Churchill Society and the Churchill Archive Centre. That's on the 13th of April. And that's on the subject of Churchill's Europe. So very topical. Those will be 2 excellent events. So please do register to book your place. So thank you once again, Adam. Thanks to all of you for coming. Wishing you a very pleasant evening, and I hope to see you again soon.
Thank you all very much for your attention and for your very interesting questions. Which I could say more about.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.